At the country's most exclusive engagement party, he raised her hand for the world to see, a diamond the size of a quail's egg, his new fiancée, his new life, and right then, his ex-wife smiled, said nothing, and vanished. But here's what he didn't know. While he showed off his new prize, she was boarding a private jet with a billionaire. By the time he found out, it was too late. But this didn't start with a diamond or a jet. It started with a woman named Elaine Carter. For 15 years, Elaine was known in Manhattan social circles as Mrs. Carter, wife of Darius Carter, the venture capitalist who was often praised in financial magazines for his ruthless acquisitions and expensive taste in everything. She was the woman who stood beside the man with the Midas touch, the one who could turn failing companies into gold mines. To the outside world, they were the power couple that had it all: money, influence, connections. But inside their home, Elaine was slowly becoming invisible. Darius loved attention, loved being seen, and somewhere along the line his wife became just another shadow in his orbit. At first the neglect was subtle. Missed anniversaries, forgotten birthdays, the dinners where he'd spend more time on his phone than looking into her eyes. Then came the whispers, the socialites who exchanged knowing glances, the sudden appearances of younger women on his arm at charity galas while Elaine stood pretending not to notice. But she noticed, everyone noticed, and still, she stayed. Until the day she didn't. When Elaine quietly filed for divorce, it barely made a ripple in the media. Darius, on the other hand, ensured his narrative dominated the headlines. The ambitious husband who outgrew his wife. Weeks later, he introduced his new fiancée, Vanessa Lee, a 28-year-old model turned influencer who proudly flaunted her diamond ring on Instagram with captions that mocked, "Starting over with upgrades." Darius paraded Vanessa through every room that Elaine used to occupy, the restaurants, the art galleries, the charity functions, as though he was erasing Elaine from the city's memory. But what no one knew was that while Elaine was vanishing from the public eye, she was rebuilding quietly, strategically. She wasn't attending charity dinners anymore. She was attending board meetings. And while Darius was too busy showing off Vanessa, Elaine was making new connections. Powerful ones. Among them was Malcolm Royce, a name that never made it to the tabloids but whispered in Wall Street corridors with a mix of respect and fear. A billionaire with stakes in industries that Darius could only dream of penetrating. Malcolm didn't need a red carpet. His power was quieter, more permanent. By the time the engagement party rolled around, the one where Darius showed off Vanessa's ring to the applause of Manhattan's elite, Elaine was already on her way to the private airfield where Malcolm's jet awaited. She didn't make an announcement, she didn't need to, because by the time Darius heard the rumors, the ones about his ex-wife being seen stepping out of a Gulfstream jet with Malcolm Royce in the south of France, the world wasn't laughing with him anymore. They were laughing at him. The woman he discarded had just secured herself a seat next to one of the world's most powerful men, not through seduction, but through sheer intelligence and quiet strategy. What no one understood, not even Darius, was that Elaine never wanted revenge. She wanted freedom, and she got it in a way that Darius could never buy with all his millions. The ring he flaunted that night, it was a spectacle. The jet Elaine boarded, that was permanence. That was power. That was her way of saying, "I win." Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who really was Elaine Carter? The woman Darius Carter thought he could discard like an outdated suit, and more importantly, how did she go from overlooked ex-wife to the companion of a man like Malcolm Royce, a billionaire so discreet that most people in the city couldn't even recognize his face, but whose money touched everything from tech empires to international banking? What kind of connection could they possibly share? Was it love? Was it strategy? Or was it something far more calculated? Because while Darius was busy parading Vanessa Lee around like a trophy, Elaine was laying groundwork that no one saw coming. And the question that still echoes through the upper circles of Manhattan is simple. How did Darius Carter's triumphant reintroduction to the world with his glittering fiancée, his extravagant party, his obnoxiously expensive ring, end with him as the punchline of his own celebration. What exactly was Elaine Carter doing while her name was being erased from every room? What deal was made between her and Malcolm Royce that night when she quietly boarded his jet, dressed in nothing but a simple silk dress and the kind of dignity that Darius could never buy? And how did the man who thought he'd won the breakup end up watching his ex-wife succeed in a way that left him both powerless and humiliated? These are the questions people still ask. Because behind every headline and Instagram post, there was always something else happening. A silent observer in every room, a quiet negotiation behind every smile, and a devastating checkmate in a game Darius didn't even realize he was playing. What really happened between them? Who was watching the whole time? And how did it all end in a public humiliation that the king of acquisitions never recovered from? Keep watching, because the answers, they're just getting started. Catherine Sterling wasn't born into wealth, but she knew how to move through it. Raised in a modest suburb just outside Chicago, she was the daughter of a literature professor and a nurse, both of whom instilled in her a sharp mind, a quiet grace, and an unwavering sense of self. She studied art history, loved jazz, and preferred old libraries to loud galas. Yet, somehow, she still caught the eye of Richard Sterling. Richard, on the other hand, was everything Catherine was not. The son of an infamous financier, he inherited not just his father's money, but his hunger for more. Charismatic, devastatingly charming, and utterly relentless, Richard Sterling didn't just want success, he wanted worship. He built his empire through calculated acquisitions, making a name for himself on Wall Street not because he was the richest, but because he was the most feared. When Catherine met Richard, he wasn't yet the man plastered across business magazines. He was ambitious, rough around the edges, but he made her laugh. He made her feel seen. Their marriage began with promise. Weekend escapes to the countryside, midnight conversations about dreams, futures, the kind of partnership that felt equal. But success changed Richard. With each zero added to his net worth, another piece of their partnership dissolved. What was once laughter became silence. Richard stopped asking her opinion and started making decisions alone about their home, their investments, their life. His attention drifted, first subtly, then unapologetically, to younger women with glossy hair, socialites with plastic smiles, influencers who knew how to pose in the perfect light. Catherine, once the love of his life, became furniture in her own home, always present, rarely acknowledged. She watched as Richard transformed into a man who wore his status like armor, parading his acquisitions, his cars, his properties, and eventually his new companions. And yet, Catherine said nothing. She smiled. She stayed. But beneath that quiet exterior, she was watching, learning, calculating. Their divorce was less of a breakup and more of a press release. Richard ensured that the story framed him as the man seeking passion, renewal, excitement. Catherine was painted as the stale chapter in his book, the one he was brave enough to close. Headlines buzzed. Sterling split, new flame in the picture. Paparazzi caught Richard and Vanessa Lee, a 28-year-old influencer with a penchant for yacht selfies and curated elegance, attending every gala Catherine used to host. It was public, it was intentional, and it was humiliating. But Catherine wasn't just smart, she was patient. She understood that wealth was temporary, but power, real power, was permanent. While Richard was busy curating his new image, Catherine was rebuilding hers, not on the glossy pages of magazines, but in the rooms where real deals were made. She didn't need the headlines, she needed the leverage. And quietly, methodically, she was about to secure it in a way that Richard Sterling would never see coming. It was the kind of party that only people like Richard Sterling could conceive, a grand display of wealth, influence, and vanity disguised as a celebration of love. Held at the Carlyle in Manhattan, the room glimmered under chandeliers imported from Venice. Champagne flowed like water, and a quartet played classical renditions of pop songs because nothing said elegance like old money pretending to appreciate new trends. Richard stood at the center of it all, his arm around Isabella, a 26-year-old model with porcelain skin, a disarming smile, and an Instagram following that rivaled small countries. But tonight, it wasn't her beauty that stole the room's attention. It was the ring. A cushion-cut diamond, flawless, sitting on her delicate finger like it had been placed there by royalty itself. $500,000 imported from a private vault in Geneva, and it sparkled with every flick of her wrist. Photographers captured every angle. Socialites gushed. Businessmen raised their glasses in approval. And Richard, he basked in it. The younger woman, the younger life, the diamond, the legacy. It was his proof that he had won. Somewhere in the back of the room stood Catherine Sterling. She had been invited as a formality, a nod to civility and social appearances, but everyone was watching her, not out of concern, but curiosity. Would she cry? Would she crack? Would she make a scene? Catherine did none of those things. She stood in a midnight blue dress, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. She watched Richard lift Isabella's hand into the air for the cameras, watched as the crowd fawned over them, watched as her name was buried beneath applause, and then she smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't bitter, it was quiet, a smile that meant something no one in that room could understand. Without a word, she turned and left before dessert was even served. What the room didn't know, what Richard didn't know, was that Catherine wasn't going home to cry or drink or wallow. She was headed straight to the private airfield on the edge of the city. Waiting on the tarmac was a jet, sleek, dark, unbranded, and already prepared for takeoff. And sitting inside with a glass of Bordeaux and a file open on his tablet was Michael Hawthorne. A name that never made tabloids, a face that rarely saw daylight, but a fortune that made Richard Sterling look like a man still playing with monopoly money. Hawthorne wasn't just rich. He was the kind of wealthy that owned the patents behind the products billionaires invested in. He didn't seek attention. He controlled the people who paid for it. As Catherine stepped onto the plane, she wasn't met with fanfare. There were no cameras, no onlookers, just Hawthorne, who looked up from his screen and simply said, "You're right on time." And with that, the door closed, the engines roared to life, and the jet disappeared into the night sky. Back at the engagement party, the cameras kept flashing, the laughter continued, and Richard Sterling kept grinning, oblivious to the fact that while he was showing off a ring, his ex-wife was already 30,000 feet above him, seated beside a man whose power didn't need to be flaunted. The question remains, how did Catherine Sterling, a woman publicly discarded and dismissed, find herself in the company of the world's most private billionaire? Was this all part of a quiet revenge, years in the making, or was it fate? An accidental alignment of power and opportunity. One thing was clear. While Richard Sterling was busy chasing appearances, Catherine Sterling was playing a far more dangerous, far more permanent game. It took 3 days. 3 days for Richard Sterling's meticulously curated headlines about his engagement to be swallowed whole by something far more salacious. The first photo surfaced on a small European blog, grainy, but unmistakable. Catherine Sterling, dressed in understated elegance, stepping off a private jet in Monaco. And right behind her, descending the steps casually, was none other than Michael Hawthorne. Within hours, the photo was everywhere, splashed across gossip sites, financial news outlets, even morning talk shows that usually had no time for the comings and goings of reclusive billionaires. But this was different. Catherine Sterling, the discarded ex-wife, seen side by side with a man whose very presence shifted stock markets. Suddenly, it wasn't Richard Sterling's engagement that people were talking about. It was Catherine. She was the headline. She was the mystery. And Richard? He became a footnote. Social media didn't hold back. Comments flooded in with cutting precision. She didn't just move on, she moved up. From millionaire to billionaire, now that's a glow-up. You flexed a ring, she flexed a fleet. The jokes, the memes, the side-by-side comparisons of Richard's flashy ring to Hawthorne's $100 million Gulfstream, it was relentless. Richard watched it unfold, powerless to stop it, each headline cutting deeper than the last. In the space of days, his narrative collapsed. The man who thought he'd won the divorce was now the subject of ridicule, his fiancée's diamond overshadowed by a jet's polished stairs. The media frenzy didn't stop at the photos. Speculations ran wild. Were Catherine and Hawthorne lovers? Old friends? Secret business partners? Did they meet after the divorce? Or worse, had Richard been the fool all along, parading his new conquest while his ex-wife was quietly cultivating alliances that mattered? Interviews with anonymous insiders painted a picture of Catherine that no one had bothered to see before. She wasn't just the elegant wife of a finance mogul. She was a strategist. She had spent years attending dinners, galas, fundraisers, not just as decoration, but as a silent observer, building networks, studying the true centers of power. And at the center of that web was Michael Hawthorne. But here's where it got interesting. The real twist that rewrote everything Richard thought he knew. Catherine and Hawthorne hadn't just met recently. They had known each other for years. Quietly, privately, away from the flashbulbs and red carpets. Catherine had been investing alongside Hawthorne through discreet shell companies, building silent empires in technology, infrastructure, even renewable energy. She wasn't just the ex-wife of a wealthy man. She was an operator, moving in spaces Richard didn't even know existed. While he was collecting socialites and flaunting engagement rings, she was assembling power, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, through alliances that didn't need the approval of paparazzi or the blessing of social media. And by the time Richard Sterling realized it, the story was no longer about him. It was about the woman he thought he had left behind, and the empire she had been quietly building while he was too busy watching himself in the mirror. While Richard Sterling was busy chasing youth, beauty, and fleeting admiration, Catherine Sterling was building something far less visible, but infinitely more enduring. Power. Quietly, methodically, without a single press release or whispered rumor. As the tabloids pieced together Catherine's unexpected proximity to Michael Hawthorne, deeper investigations uncovered what few could have predicted. Catherine was not simply his companion, nor was she just another face in his rare public appearances. She was his partner. For 5 years, stretching back into the final deteriorating stretch of her marriage to Richard, Catherine had been more than just a presence at social gatherings. She had been at the table, an official board member in Hawthorne's sprawling holding company. Through discreet channels, she had equity stakes in industries that Richard's empire couldn't even access. Renewable energy, space tech, advanced AI firms. Catherine wasn't playing catch-up to Richard's public displays of wealth. She was playing an entirely different game. She didn't need diamonds on her fingers or flashy galas to validate her worth, because while Richard built a castle on status, Catherine built a kingdom on strategy. And it wasn't just strategy in business. It was psychological. She understood the long game, the art of patience, the power of silence. While Richard was busy ensuring that everyone knew he had moved on, Catherine was ensuring that her next move was permanent. She wasn't just remembered, she was untouchable. But the final blow to Richard's pride and ego didn't even come from Catherine herself. No grand speeches, no bitter interviews, no retaliatory posts. It came from the very man Richard had underestimated because he didn't even know to look for him, Michael Hawthorne. And what Hawthorne did next was nothing short of a checkmate in a game Richard never realized he was playing. Months after the spectacle of Richard Sterling's engagement party faded from the headlines, another event captured the attention of the world's financial elite. The Global Capital Forum, an exclusive summit where only the most influential minds in business and finance gathered behind closed doors. It was a stage Richard had always craved but never quite commanded. And this year, he wasn't the one drawing eyes. As the attendees sipped their aged scotch and exchanged whispers about market shifts and private mergers, the room fell unexpectedly silent when Michael Hawthorne, a man whose appearances were rarer than eclipses, took the stage. But it wasn't Hawthorne's presence that caused the murmurs. It was the woman standing beside him, Catherine Sterling. Dressed in classic, understated elegance, she stood poised, composed, and unmistakably present. And then, with a casual authority that didn't require applause or ceremony, Hawthorne introduced her, not just as his partner in business, but as his fiancée. The announcement echoed like a thunderclap through the corridors of power. Yet that wasn't the only surprise. Within days, it became public knowledge, quietly disclosed in shareholder reports, subtly noted by analysts, that Catherine, through a series of strategic investments guided by Hawthorne, now owned a significant stake in Sterling Holdings, Richard's own company. While Richard had been too busy flaunting engagement rings and social media status, the very foundation of his empire had been quietly infiltrated by the woman he thought he left behind. Richard had the headlines. Catherine had the power. She didn't just win, she owned the game. And to this day, Richard Sterling never saw it coming. What do you think? Was Catherine Sterling playing the long game all along? Did she quietly map out every move while Richard Sterling was too distracted by his own reflection to notice? Or was it something simpler? Patience, timing, and knowing that some victories don't need to be loud to be permanent? If you were in Catherine's shoes, would you have waited, watched, or would you have struck back sooner, made a statement, reclaimed your place with fire instead of silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. And if you thought this was cold, wait until you hear about the woman who faked her death just to catch her cheating husband. Subscribe now, because you don't want to miss that one.